All right. So this is the third part of chapter 14. It's on hormones and the regulation in the reproductive system. So far we've looked at the anatomy of the reproductive system for male and female, as well as the STIs that are possible and sort of how they affect reproduction. So yeah, let's start off on 14.3. So the chromosomal sex, or the genetic sex of an individual, is determined at fertilization. In humans and other mammals, an embryo that carries the sex chromosomes combination XY is genetically male. An embryo that carries the sex combination of XX is genetically female. The chromosomal sex remains constant throughout the life of an individual. So if you're XX when you're born, you'll be XX for your whole life. Does not change. The structure and function of the male and female reproductive system are more than just a matter of genetics. Until about the 7th week of development, so just shy of 2 months, male and female embryos are anatomically identical. This means that you can't tell whether you're going to have a male or a female by looking at it because they look exactly the same. The reproductive system hasn't been developed. The presence or absence of a specific hormone determines which sex organs develop, and when the sex organs develop, when the sex organs mature, and how they function. Many of the same reproductive hormones are at work in both males and females. The interactions of genetics and hormonal factors produce different reproductive systems in each. So basically what it's saying here is the difference between a male and a female is whether a certain hormone is present or absent. This is basically, if we can go ahead a little bit, the presence of androgens will create a male, where the absence of them will create a female. So let's look a little bit deeper into the male reproductive system. So the development of the male sex organs begins before birth. The Y chromosome carries the gene called the testes determining factor, TDF, gene. So that Y carries this gene and it triggers the production of the male sex hormone, which is called androgens. The presence of androgens initiates the development of male sex organs and ducts in the fetus. As the reproductive structures develop, they migrate within the body to their final locations. The testes first develop in the abdominal cavity, and during the 3rd month of fetal development, the testes begin to descend towards the scrotum. This process is not complete until shortly before birth. So the testes are developing sort of in the stomach area of the fetus, and just before they're born, they will join the scrotum. So the scrotum is that sac that holds the testes, and they basically aren't there even in the scrotum until just before birth. A boy's genitalia are visible at birth, but the reproductive system will not be mature until puberty. Puberty is the period in which the reproductive system completes its development and becomes fully functional. Most boys enter puberty between 10 and 13 years of age. At puberty, a series of hormonal events lead to gradual physical changes in the body. These changes include the final development of the sex hormone organs and the development of the secondary sex characteristics. So you guys know what puberty is. Males go through it between 10 and 13, and this is when they will start to release the male sex hormones, which will stimulate the development of their sex organs and also their secondary sex characteristics, which we talked about a bit before. But those would be things like facial hair and wider shoulders and just changes to their body, maybe a growth spurt. Puberty begins when the hypothalamus increases the production of gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. So back to, this is a feedback loop just like we did in the endocrine system. The hypothalamus releases GnRH. It acts on the anterior pituitary gland, so that anterior part, not posterior, causing it to release two sex hormones, which is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. Don't know what this is up. Oops. There we go. In males, these hormones cause the testes to begin producing sperm and release testosterone. So they need these hormones to start to produce sperm. Those hormones are what is going to tell your body to start produce sperm and to release testosterone, the male sex hormone. Testosterone acts on various tissues to complete the development of the sex organs and sexual characteristics. So this release of testosterone is going to help to develop the person into a man, I guess we could say. From the end of puberty, the male reproductive system is usually capable of producing millions of sperm every hour of the day, 7 days a week until death. The same hormones that trigger the event of puberty also regulate the mature male reproductive system over a person's lifetime. Hormone feedback mechanisms control the process of the spermatogenesis, so that is the creation of the sperm, and they maintain the secondary sexual characteristics. FSH causes the interstitial cells, so those cells that are inside of the testes, to produce sperm. At the same time, it also causes cells in the seminiferous tubules, so those are also within the testes, to release a hormone called inhibin. Inhibin acts on the anterior pituitary to inhibit the production of FSH. This results in a negative feedback loop, and as the levels of FSH drop, the testes release less inhibin. A decrease in the level of inhibin causes the anterior to release more FSH. So that's a lot to go through and maybe hard to understand, but basically what's happening is in the testes, or specifically in the seminiferous tubules of the testes, there is a hormone that's released to tell the body, hey, you don't need to release any more FSH, we got enough sperm, we got enough testosterone. So it's just telling it, it's feeding back to the brain and saying, hey, brain, we're good. We don't need any more. Now, so they'll release less FSH, and then when less FSH is being released, then not as much testosterone, not as much sperm would be released, and then it would send a message back to tell it to release more. So it's always sort of giving feedback to keep the levels regulated, I guess, and at a level that is acceptable. This feedback loop keeps the level of sperm production relatively constant over time. The similar feedback loop maintains the secondary sex characteristics. LH causes the testes to release testosterone, which promotes changes like muscle development and the formation of facial hair. Testosterone acts on the anterior pituitary to inhibit the release of LH. This feedback loop keeps the testosterone levels relatively constant in the body as well. Okay? So these are two feedback loops, FSH and LH, and the testosterone and the inhibin are telling it sort of how much it needs to keep that sort of loop constant and levels to be normal. Reproductive function and secondary sex characteristics both depend on the continued presence of male sex hormones. So we need those male sex hormones to still continue these, the function of the reproductive system as well as the secondary sex characteristics. Substances that interfere with the hormonal feedback system can cause changes in the reproductive system. Anabolic steroids mimic the action of testosterone in promoting muscle development. Some athletes illegally use steroids to increase their speed or strength. Steroids also disrupt the reproductive hormone feedback system. The side effects of steroids use in men may include shrinking of testicles, low sperm count, loss of body hair, and development of breasts. So steroids can help you temporarily to increase your strength, but if you continue to take them, then they will sort of stop the release of testosterone because they're a very similar um, hormone. So you'll be releasing less testosterone, which will give you less sperm. Your testicles will become smaller, and you're not going to be having the benefits of having testosterone because the steroids are going to sort of take that over. And you could start reverting to being more of a female or having female characteristics. As far as aging in the male reproductive system, a man in good health can be fertile for their entire life. So as long as you're in good health, you could have babies your entire life. Most men experience a gradual decline in their testosterone levels beginning around age 40, which is called andropause. So you may have heard of menopause. This is sort of like the male version. In some men, the hormonal change may be linked to symptoms like fatigue, depression, loss of muscle and bone mass, and a drop in sperm production. Not all men experience symptoms of andropause, and because the symptoms can vary widely, this condition is difficult to diagnose accurately. Other hormonal changes associated with aging can also affect the male reproductive system. The prostate gland often begins to grow gradually in men over 40. This can lead to discomfort and urinary difficulties because the prostate squeezes on the urethra as it grows. Older men have an increased risk of cancer of the prostate. Surgery can be used to provide relief and to reduce the cancer risk. Younger men are more prone to developing infections of the prostate. The resulting inflammation of the prostate, called prostatitis, I guess it would be called, may cause a burning sensation when urinating or need to urinate more frequently. Antibiotics are usually prescribed to fight the infection and reduce the inflammation. So a major thing that can happen is that the prostate, if you go back to the picture, I guess I could, like going back pretty far, but if we look at the prostate, so right here, so this is sort of right behind the urethra, which is where the sperm and urine come out of the male. So if this prostate gland is going to start to grow or become inflamed, that can definitely affect peeing. That's when people will say that they actually have like not a steady stream, sort of like bits of pee, and then it'll sort of be like you're closing off a hose because this prostate is pressing on the urethra. I gotta go back. So yeah, antibiotics can relieve that inflammation, as well as if you are an older man and have a risk and have discomfort, you can have surgery to relieve that sort of inflammation, but also to reduce the chance of cancer. Now let's go to females. So our understanding of the specific factors that trigger the development of female sex organs in a genetically female embryo is incomplete. So we're not 100% sure exactly how this all works. The understanding of how a female starts to be produced is still not totally sure. So that's why originally I said that, or I think I did say that female is sort of like the default. If you do not produce the hormones that are male, then you are female. And so there's some things there that are a little bit unsure of how and what triggers the females to be, or the female sex organs in a genetically female embryo to sort of develop. Until recently, scientists assumed that the development of female sex organs was a default pattern. Researchers now suspect that the process of female sex development are more complex and that specific hormonal triggers cause female sex organs to develop. A baby girl has a complete but immature set of reproductive organs at birth. North American girls usually begin puberty between 9 and 13 years of age. The basic hormones and hormonal processes of female puberty are similar to those of male puberty. A girl begins puberty when the hypothalamus increases the gonadotropin releasing hormone. This releases or acts on the anterior pituitary to trigger LH and FSH. So again, exactly the same as males, this whole process. So males produce LH and FSH just like females. But in girls, the FSH and LH act on the ovaries to produce the female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. These hormones stimulate the development of the female secondary sex characteristics and launch a reproductive cycle that will continue until about middle age. So again, females can't reproduce forever. Only about till middle age can they reproduce. In humans, female reproductive function follows a cyclical pattern known as the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle ensures that an ovum is released at the same time as the uterus is most receptive to a fertilized egg. So, this menstrual cycle that women go through allows for the egg to be, if fertilized, going to a fresh uterus. The menstrual cycle is usually about 28 days long, although it may vary considerably from one woman to the next, and even from one cycle to the next in the same woman. By convention, the cycle is said to begin with menstruation and end with the start of the next menstrual period. The menstrual cycle is actually two separate but interconnected cycles of events. One cycle takes place in the ovaries and is known as the ovarian cycle, and one cycle takes place in the uterus and is known as the uterine cycle. Both cycles are controlled by the female hormones estrogen and progesterone, which are produced by the ovaries. So let's go over those two different cycles. Let me just have a drink here. Not used to talking this much, so it's hurting my throat a little. The ovarian cycle. So it says the ovary contains cellular structures called follicles. Each follicle contains a single immature ovum. An ovum is an egg. At birth, a baby girl has about 2 million follicles. Many degenerate, leaving up to 400,000 by puberty. During her lifetime, only approximately 400 of these follicles will mature to release an ovum. In a single ovarian cycle, one follicle matures, releases an ovum, and then develops into a yellowish gland-like structure known as the corpus luteum, and then degenerates. So all that's happening in your ovarian cycle, a follicle, which is in, I'm going to go back, really need to put pictures here, which would help. So right in your ovary, there's follicles, and they're going to produce the egg. So that's happening in here. Got to go back. Oops. Sorry. So inside of the ovary, the follicle matures, releases an egg, an ovum, and then once the egg has been released, the whatever's left over of the follicle turns sort of yellowish and sort of shrivels, and that's known as the corpus luteum. There's a word for it, only for the sense that because it actually does release hormones. So the corpus luteum is actually important. It's sort of like the wrapper of the egg or the shell of the egg. We would just throw that out normally, but it's important to the cycle, so it has the name corpus luteum. Don't know why, but that is going to release some hormones, which are going to become important when we talk about this later, and then it degenerates. The ovarian cycle can be roughly divided into 2 stages. The first stage is known as the follicular cycle, so creating the follicle and the egg developing. And then the second part is called the luteal stage, and that's when the corpus luteum turns yellow, releases some hormones, and then degenerates. The follicular stage begins with an increase in the level of FSH released by the anterior pituitary gland. So this follicular stage, so when the follicle is starting to produce, that is all stimulated by the FSH. Remember, it's released from the anterior pituitary. The FSH stimulates one follicle to mature, and as the follicle matures, it releases estrogen and some progesterone. The rising levels of estrogen in the blood act on the anterior pituitary to inhibit the release of FSH. So just like in the male where rising levels of testosterone stop the LH from being released, that's what the estrogen does in the female, is it stops the FSH to be released. The estrogen triggers the sudden release of GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. This leads to a sharp increase of LH production by the anterior pituitary, triggering ovulation. So LH is a major player in this because LH, this is all during the follicular stage still, LH is going to be released from the brain down to the ovaries. It's going to stimulate the ovary to basically pop out the egg. So the follicle is going to burst open and release the ovum. Ovulation marks the end of the follicular stage and the beginning of the luteal stage. Okay, so now that the ovum is released, it can start to move its way down the oviducts or fallopian tubes in hopes that it'll be fertilized. This is called ovulation. The luteal stage, so we're moving on to the luteal stage, starts when the ovum is released. LH causes the follicle to develop into a corpus luteum, so that LH still present there is going to help the follicle to sort of go into this yellowish gland. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone and some estrogen. As the levels of these hormones rise in the blood, they act on the anterior pituitary to stop the release of FSH and LH. The corpus luteum degenerates, so it starts to shrivel up, which leads to the decrease in the levels of estrogen and progesterone, and the low levels of the sex hormones in the blood cause the anterior pituitary to increase its secretion of FSH, and the cycle begins again. So if we think about this as far as the whole cycle, let's look back here. And for the whole ovarian cycle, what's happening is it's split into 2 stages. The follicle is created, it matures, it releases at ovulation, in which it starts the luteal stage. The corpus luteum starts to shrivel, produces estrogen and progesterone, and then degenerates to start the cycle over again. So in real time, if we think about this luteal stage is only happening, it's only like 14 days of the month. So 14 days of the month, you're going to be releasing a lot more progesterone than estrogen. And then the other 14 days, you're going to be releasing more estrogen. So it's just sort of that difference. And that's why women are always our hormones are cycling. We have some hormones being released more on this day, some more a week later, and that's why you can have definitely a large difference in mood and stuff like that. If the ovum is fertilized and implants in the endometrium, going crazy. So if the ovum, that egg, is fertilized, once it's going down the fallopian tube, it will implant itself in the wall of the uterus, the endometrium. Blood hormone levels of progesterone and estrogen will remain high under the stimulus of the human chorionic gonadotropin released by the embryo supporting membranes. The continued presence of progesterone maintains the endometrium to support the developing fetus. So a lot of progesterone is released from the corpus luteum, but once that'll be released basically in the time that it takes the fertilized egg to make its way to the uterus, in which the progesterone will continue to be released and support the developing fetus. The continued presence of estrogen stops the ovarian cycle, so no additional follicle matures. So always having this estrogen and progesterone really high will basically keep your body from releasing more eggs. And that's why when you're pregnant, you don't have a menstrual cycle, because this progesterone and estrogen is telling your body, we're good, we don't need another egg. We're still maturing the egg that we have fertilized. So you only need, or you're only having these cycles when you're not pregnant. And like I've told you before, another way of how birth control works, and maybe you've taken the pill before, but that's going to raise your progesterone and estrogen levels. So you're taking a pill every day, and that's raising your levels. So it's tricking your body into thinking you're pregnant. So then you don't ever have this ovarian cycle. So you're not releasing eggs. So whenever you're taking the pill consistently, you're never actually going to release eggs. So if you don't release eggs, then you can't get pregnant. And that's how birth control pills work, which is, I guess, kind of cool. But also could be dangerous in the sense that some people, after they've taken birth control pills and these birth controls for many, many years, they have a hard time ovulating again or being able to go through this ovarian cycle. But I haven't heard that for like the pill per se. The pill is normally pretty safe, but with some people with IUDs, which we'll talk about later, but a type of metal that they put into their uterus, that is definitely a type of birth control that some people have trouble actually having an ovarian cycle again. The uterine cycle. So the uterine cycle is closely linked to the ovarian cycle. The ovulation takes place about halfway through the ovarian cycle at 14 days. The ovum survives for up to 24 hours after ovulation, and if fertilization occurs, the fertilized egg completes the passage through the oviduct and arrives at the uterus a few days later. The timing of this uterine cycle ensures that the uterus is prepared to receive and nurture a new life. Causes a buildup of blood vessels and tissues in the endometrium, okay? And if fertilization does not occur, the endometrium disintegrates and menstruation begins. So as far as the uterine cycle, it's just basically not too much going on, except for the fact that if there is no fertilization or implantation of a fertilized egg in the uterine wall, then the blood vessels and tissues of the endometrium, so that layer inside of the uterus, will disintegrate, and then it will flush out and restock itself. So the only reason that menstruation is happening is so that there's fresh lining of your uterus to be able to allow for the developing fetus to be able to survive and to thrive. So those blood vessels and tissues will continuously, in a cycle, regenerate so that the best is there for the developing fetus. The uterine cycle begins on the first day of menstruation. On this day, the corpus luteum has degenerated and the levels of sex hormones in the blood are low. As a new follicle begins to mature and release estrogen, the levels of estrogen in the blood will gradually increase. Beginning around the 6th day of the uterine cycle, the estrogen level is high, enough to cause the endometrium to begin thickening. So the estrogen in the blood is going to tell the uterus basically to start to thicken and start to create those good blood vessels, being ready for that 14-day mark, because that's at the 14-day mark, that is when, or between the 14 to like 18-day mark, is when a fertilized egg could make its way into the uterus, and it's got to get thick and ready to keep that baby developing. After ovulation, the release of progesterone by the corpus luteum causes a more rapid thickening of the endometrium. So the more progesterone is going to tell, like, okay, it's almost time, guys. Let's get the walls of the uterus ready. And between day 15 and 23 of the cycle, the thickness of the endometrium may double or even triple. So it's really, really getting ready for the arrival of the fertilized egg. So if fertilization doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum will degenerate. That will make the progesterone levels go down, which will allow for menstruation to start. So the progesterone levels are keeping that endometrium thick and ready. Once they start to tank, well, then the endometrium will also tank, break down, and you'll start your period. After puberty, the male reproductive system can continue to produce viable sperm for a lifetime. In contrast, as a female, functioning follicles will decrease with age, which leads to gradual overall decline in the amount of estrogen and progesterone in the blood. So the follicles will get older, less estrogen and progesterone in the blood, and as hormone levels drop, a woman's menstrual cycle will become irregular. Within a few years, it stops altogether. The end of the menstrual cycle is known as menopause. Among North American women, the average age of menopause is around 50, but menopause can begin later or earlier. So menopause is that time where you're going to stop having menstrual cycle, and when you stop your menstrual cycle, that's going to basically stop your chances of being able to reproduce. A woman who has completed menopause no longer produces ova, so she is no longer fertile. The decrease in the sex hormone disrupts the homeostasis of a number of hormone systems. During menopause, blood vessels are alternatively constrict and dilate, resulting in an uncomfortable sensation for some women known as hot flashes. So the blood vessels will bring blood in and out, and that can cause women to have hot flashes and variations in mood. Menopause is associated with rising cholesterol levels, diminishing bone mass, and increased risk of uterine cancer, breast cancer, and heart disease. So after going through menopause, that total change in your body can diminish your bone mass. So your bones won't be as strong, which can lead to other problems like osteoporosis, the cholesterol levels, which can lead to gaining weight per se, or be hard on your heart, which can cause heart disease, and then your uterine cancer, so having cancer in your uterus, as well as breast cancer, just because of the change in the hormones. Many women consider hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, during or following menopause. Hormone replacement therapy is a prescription of low levels of estrogen with or without progesterone. The treatment also carries a number of health risks. So there's increased risk of coronary heart disease, strokes and blood clots, breast cancer and colorectal cancer, and then increased risk of dementia. Health Canada advises that women should not begin hormone replacement therapy without a thorough medical evaluation and careful assessment of her particular needs, health, and medical history. Okay, so hormone therapy, yeah, it could be if you're having really bad symptoms, but again, definitely not something that you should possibly do long term because there's many risks. Okay, so that is chapter 14. We'll continue with chapter 15 next, but I would like you guys to try and finish chapter 14 by the end of this week, just so we can continue to move along and get through this as much as we can by the end of the school year. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'm always here to lend a hand. Thanks so much, and talk to you guys soon.